It's the Geneva Motor Show this week, and the sharp focus is very much on electric vehicles. But what does this mean for the mining sector, and who is in front of the race to supply the metals needed to support this burgeoning sector? John Meyer joins us now from SP Angel. John, welcome. Remind us which metals we're talking about here, because it's quite a specific area, but they're very much part of mining language at the moment.
There's a whole range of metals, but they're all going to be in short supply if the IEA numbers are to be believed on electric vehicle growth. We start with copper, the most common material, nickel, graphite, cobalt, lithium. Clearly, the lithium-ion technology is not going away. And let's not forget the rare earths, very important for the permanent magnets that help to make these cars more efficient.
Yeah. What about the race to supply nationally? Who's competing in the race to supply the funding and the project background?
Well, countries are waking up to the strategic issues here, because everybody wants to have a battery industry or an auto industry, you know, to grow at home. Particularly important for the UK, because we've produced an awful lot of cars in this country over the years, and we don't want to fall behind. BMW and Volkswagen don't want to fall behind either. The Japanese are pulling back to Japan, not surprisingly, because they need to retool and redevelop their product lines. China is really pushing ahead very, very fast and very strongly, and has been moving to gain control of a lot of the raw material supply. And the US, of course, have woken up and said they've doubled the amount of money going into OPIC, which is one of the huge funds. So $30 billion has become $60 billion to invest in projects around the world. OPIC used to really focus on aid projects, water-type projects around the world, humanitarian-type stuff. They now have a mandate to focus on developing US influence on projects for raw materials, for electric vehicle growth, for battery growth around the world, so that the US doesn't get left out and get left behind. The European Union has a strategy as well for the strategic and critical raw materials, and India is in the race too. So it is quite possible, if you've got a leading project somewhere in the world, China, India, the US, Europe, no doubt some other nations, could all be competing to secure that raw material supply going forward.
Well, let's pick up on one of those, actually, because I was talking earlier in the week to Robin Young, the Chief Executive of Meyer Minerals, to have this project coming on the nickel space, and he's moving ahead quite neatly with that. But I noticed from his most recent release that he's engaging the Chinese specifically. Although it's a project based in Russia, China seems to be the focus at the moment, so clearly that backs up what you were saying about the involvement of China. But let's take nickel as one of the metals that you mentioned at the top, copper, lithium, cobalt and so forth, and ask a little bit more about the demand for these metals in the context of, as I say, this run into electric vehicles. We've only got very few electric vehicle manufacturers at the moment. As I say, they're all showing at the Geneva Motor Show. But in terms of projections, in terms of some of the numbers and some of the demand that we're going to be getting for some of these metals, what are we looking at here in terms of increases in supply that's needed to supply this new sector?
Well, with nickel, current world market production is 2.3 million tonnes a year, and if we go with the IEA numbers on electric vehicle growth, then the world, using existing battery chemistries, would be looking for about 13 million tonnes of nickel per year going forwards, and that's an extraordinary amount of metal consumption, and we wouldn't know where it's all going to come from. Now, Meyer Minerals has one of the world's leading undeveloped nickel projects, and so it's quite natural for countries to say, well, we want a strategic stake in this. China, of course, is borders with the Amur region of Russia, so it's very easy for China to go into Amur. In fact, there is precedence for it, for Chinese companies to go into and develop the raw materials within that region. The Russians see it as a long way from Moscow. They see it as more remote. And to be honest, if you're in Moscow, it is much more remote than if you're in China. And so the Chinese are naturals to go in here. And the Chinese do seem to have more cash available. If you think, well, Russia's under sanctions, cash is expensive and short in supply in Russia, But the Chinese seem to have a lot of this, and they are very focused on grabbing as much production as they can going forwards.
I believe you're connected with Amur Minerals, is that right, as professionally?
Amur is one of our clients. We've been helping them for many years. I've known Robin Young for about 15 years. He's steered this project very successfully through the Russian permitting system, so it's really well set. Given that this is a strategic project from a Russian perspective, they've actually had very good support from the Russian authorities, which is good. In fact, I think it suits the Russians for this to be a very independent type project. And there is a bridge being built at the moment from China into the Amur region, and I think it's very well placed. I mean, it's quite remote. It's going to cost just over $100 million to build a road into the project. But when that road is built, and that would be helpful for opening up the region, then this project becomes very, very accessible.
What about demand for some of the other metals as we look out to some of the expectations for motor vehicle sales in the electric space? What about copper and cobalt? Presumably there's a massive deficit at the moment of supply of these metals in the context of what's going to be demanded in later years.
Well, the cobalt market, cobalt producers have responded quite strongly. I mean, they're mainly small operations in the DRC that have ramped up production, although there are some bigger players like Glencore and Tenke Fungurume, which was bought by the Chinese. But a lot of these small mum-and-pop operations, and some which sadly are run by warlords, where the money doesn't necessarily go to the right place, they've ramped up their production to meet demand. So actually cobalt prices came crashing back last year. But I think that will rise again because the world needs more and more cobalt, and there's really not enough production in the world going forwards to meet any of the battery chemistries that are being proposed by the new battery producers.
So where is the biggest deficit?
Well, in terms of millions of tons, copper will be the biggest one, because electric vehicles are going to need more copper than is produced by the world on an annual basis. And given that most of the world's copper goes into plumbing and wiring for construction and things like that, if more than that gets used for electric vehicles, then there's clearly going to be a huge disconnect, and we're going to need to double the world's mine supply going forwards. And that's easier said than done, because where are these new mines coming from? I mean, SolGold, for example, another one of our clients, has a huge project out in Ecuador, but we don't know of many other projects of that scale, and do copper prices support the development of that project today? It's still not yet known. We're waiting to see the feasibility study numbers on that. So the world is going to have to find a lot of these new mines. The biggest market deficit is probably going to be in lithium. Lithium, because it's so light, is likely to be the preferred chemistry for decades to come, certainly for the next 10 years. And the world is probably going to need 100 times more lithium than is currently being produced. Now, there are new mines around, and it's relatively common in the Earth's crust, but you need to find it in sensible grades, you need to find it in sensible locations. And there aren't enough mines being on the block right now. There's certainly not enough mine production to meet all this demand if everybody ramps up to what's being expected.
Haven't seen many headlines, I should say, around M&A in the sector yet. Do you think that's still to come?
Well, there's been a certain amount of M&A, and I think there is a lot more to come. And what's going to be interesting is if we suddenly see the Chinese competing with the Americans, the Europeans, and the Indians to get into these projects. I think valuations could move significantly higher.
Let's just move back, if I can, to talk about the point you made about OPEC and the $60 billion, I believe, of funding being directed towards African mining. I think that's where the Americans are focusing quite a lot of money. And what sort of transformation effect is that going to have on some of these African nations with areas of interest for the US?
Well, I think if we go with the rhetoric that's come out of Donald Trump, and he has been directing the agencies to some degree, or at least that they should be following what the president says. Yeah. Not that they necessarily will do. But OPEC was focused on a lot of African investment for helping humanitarian type projects. But now with a renewed focus towards Africa, towards projects that the Chinese were moving into relatively cheaply, And the Americans are saying, well, look, you can't let the Chinese control all this stuff. We've got to have a say in this, and we need to push back the Chinese influence and reassert ourselves as important players within these areas and make sure we've got access to the metal supply.
And the US stealing a march on all this over China, or is it just a question of catching up so far as the US is concerned?
It's definitely a question of catching up. The Americans, I think, have been slow to respond. The OPEC money hasn't been coming out from what I can see. I know people who are bidding on that money on large chunks. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, and hopefully that money will start to feed through and start, for investment, and we'll see it when it comes, and you will get to know who's got the biggest pots of cash. But it's a lot of money, and when we look around at the number of listed companies looking for that cash, okay, there's a lot of money they can absorb when they come to build these mines. But actually, they don't need such a lot of money to develop the feasibility studies for the early stages. And now, one of the key differences here is OPEC now has a mandate for equity funding, whereas a lot of it was previously just debt. So that's an important difference. That means that small companies like Macango and Codal Minerals, which is another one of our clients in the lithium space, or Iron Ridge, should be able to access equity cash to develop the feasibility work on these projects, the early stage work, and also to fund the equity component of the debt capital for actually building out these projects. Now, that's very important, because what it means is these projects should get going much quicker than they might have done previously.
Funding's so important. John, look, we'll leave it there, but thanks indeed for joining us. That was John Meyer from SP Angel taking a look at the follow-through from the Geneva Motor Show, which is front and centre in the electric battery market this week.